The fall of a dynasty in ancient Persia was rarely a single moment of political transfer. It was a prolonged process involving negotiation, calculated violence, ritual humiliation, and the careful management of surviving royal figures whose existence carried both symbolic power and political risk. Among these figures, captive queens occupied a particularly complex position. Their treatment reveals the intersection of gender, legitimacy, and imperial governance within successive Persian regimes, from the Achaemenid period through the tumultuous transitions that followed later imperial fractures. Historical records indicate that queens in Persian royal households were not merely ceremonial spouses. They often controlled estates, commanded administrative staff, and participated in court patronage networks that extended across provinces. Administrative tablets from Persepolis suggest that royal women oversaw large labor forces, managed distribution of rations, and maintained economic independence within the framework of the imperial court. This structural authority meant that, when a ruling house was displaced, queens were not simply private individuals. They embodied continuity of legitimacy, represented potential nodes of resistance, and served as living reminders of displaced sovereignty. Contemporary accounts describe that conquering rulers understood the symbolic value of controlling royal women. Capturing a queen was frequently equivalent to capturing a narrative of victory. Yet surviving documents suggest that outright execution of queens was relatively uncommon compared to the treatment of male claimants. The political calculus was pragmatic. Killing a queen could provoke unrest among factions loyal to the previous dynasty, particularly if she was connected to influential noble families. Moreover, Persian imperial ideology often emphasized order and continuity over annihilation, encouraging strategies that neutralized rivals without unnecessary disruption. Greek chroniclers, despite their external perspective and occasional bias, noted the remarkable degree of protection afforded to certain captive Persian royal women following major conflicts. After the defeat of Darius III, for example, accounts describe how members of the royal household, including queens and princesses, were taken into custody but treated with ceremonial respect. While these narratives must be approached cautiously, cross-referencing with Persian administrative practices supports the broader observation that elite female captives were frequently preserved within controlled environments rather than subjected to public punishment. Legal codes of the period reveal that royal women retained defined social status even in captivity. Their confinement often resembled supervised residence rather than imprisonment in the punitive sense. They were provided attendance, maintained restricted mobility within palace complexes, and continued to receive provisions commensurate with their rank. This arrangement allowed the conquering authority to display magnanimity while simultaneously preventing queens from serving as focal points for organized rebellion. Surviving documents suggest that relocation was a primary mechanism of control. Queens were frequently moved away from their original power bases and placed within administrative centers loyal to the new regime. This geographical separation weakened their ability to communicate with former supporters and disrupted established patronage networks. In some cases, queens were integrated into the victor's court, where their presence functioned as both a symbol of conquest and a subtle assertion of continuity between dynasties. Chroniclers noted that marriage politics played a decisive role in the fate of captive queens. Strategic unions between conquering rulers and royal women of the defeated house could transform potential rivals into instruments of legitimacy. Such marriages were not always personal unions in the conventional sense. They were diplomatic acts embedded within broader imperial strategies. Through these arrangements, conquerors could claim association with established royal bloodlines, thereby reducing resistance among provincial elites accustomed to hereditary rule. At the same time, contemporary accounts describe the psychological constraints experienced by captive queens. Although physical conditions might appear outwardly comfortable, the loss of autonomy, uncertainty regarding family members, and constant surveillance produced a different form of confinement. Royal women who had previously exercised administrative authority were reduced to figures whose movements, correspondence, and social interactions were carefully monitored. The transformation from political actor to managed symbol represented a profound alteration of identity that historical sources rarely articulate directly, but imply through patterns of restricted activity. Administrative correspondence indicates that eunuchs and court officials played a central role in supervising captive queens. Their responsibilities included regulating access, transmitting orders, and ensuring that communication with external factions remained limited. This bureaucratic management reflects the broader Persian emphasis on structured governance, even in matters of dynastic transition. Captivity was not improvised. It was systematized within existing administrative frameworks. Evidence from later Persian and Near Eastern transitions suggests that economic dependency was another key mechanism of control. While queens continued to receive provisions, their independent estates were often confiscated or redistributed. Revenue streams that had previously supported their patronage activities were redirected to the new ruling authority. Without access to resources, the capacity of captive queens to sponsor loyal retainers or influence provincial actors diminished significantly. Yet surviving records also indicate that complete isolation was not always feasible or desirable. Queens retained ceremonial roles during court rituals, particularly those emphasizing dynastic continuity and divine favor. Their participation in such ceremonies could reassure segments of the population that cosmic and political order had not been entirely disrupted. This carefully calibrated visibility illustrates how captive queens functioned simultaneously as controlled individuals and public instruments of stability. Contemporary accounts further describe the varied experiences among queens depending on age, lineage, and maternal status. Mothers of potential heirs were subject to particularly close supervision, as their children represented future claimants who could destabilize the regime. In some cases, young princes were raised within the court of the conqueror, a practice that combined hostage-taking with cultural assimilation. The presence of their mothers within the same controlled environment reinforced this strategy, allowing emotional bonds to persist while political independence was curtailed. Historical records indicate that not all captive queens remained passive figures. Subtle forms of influence persisted through interpersonal relationships, religious patronage, and informal advisory roles. Even under surveillance, royal women could shape court dynamics by forming alliances with influential officials or members of the new ruling family. These interactions rarely appear in official inscriptions, but can be inferred from patterns of favor distribution and the persistence of certain administrative personnel associated with former royal households. Chroniclers noted episodes in which captive queens became focal points for conspiracies or restoration attempts. Such cases, while relatively rare, reveal the enduring symbolic power attached to royal women. The response of authorities in these situations tended to involve increased surveillance, further relocation, or enforced seclusion rather than immediate execution. This preference underscores the persistent concern that overtly harsh treatment could provoke wider unrest or martyrdom narratives. Religious considerations also shaped the treatment of captive queens. Persian imperial ideology, influenced by Zoroastrian concepts of order and cosmic balance, placed importance on maintaining social hierarchy even amid political upheaval. Royal women, as participants in court rituals and guardians of dynastic lineage, occupied a space that could not easily be reconciled with public degradation. Respectful containment aligned more closely with prevailing notions of maintaining harmony within the imperial order. Archaeological evidence from palace complexes suggests the existence of segregated residential quarters designed for elite women, including those no longer politically dominant. These spaces combined comfort with architectural control, featuring limited points of access and proximity to administrative oversight. The design of such environments illustrates how physical space itself functioned as an instrument of governance, reinforcing both protection and restriction. Surviving documents suggest that over time, the political significance of captive queens often diminished as new generations consolidated power. Some queens spent decades within supervised residence, gradually transitioning from figures of political concern to respected elders within the court environment. Their later lives, while still constrained, could involve participation in charitable activities, religious observances, and the upbringing of younger royal members, reflecting a gradual absorption into the social fabric of the victorious dynasty. The treatment of captive queens after dynastic overthrows in ancient Persia therefore reveals a pattern characterized less by overt brutality and more by calculated management. Their lives were shaped by relocation, surveillance, controlled privilege, and strategic integration into new political structures. These measures allowed conquering authorities to neutralize potential threats while preserving the symbolic continuity necessary for stable imperial governance. The quiet negotiation between respect and control, Visibility and restriction, autonomy and dependency formed the lived reality of queens whose dynasties had fallen, but whose presence continued to influence the delicate balance of power within the Persian imperial world. Surviving court traditions indicate that the integration of captive queens into the administrative and ceremonial life of the conqueror's court was rarely accidental. It reflected a deliberate imperial practice aimed at stabilizing elite networks while preventing fragmentation among noble families whose loyalties were closely tied to royal women. Persian governance relied heavily on cooperation with aristocratic lineages across vast territories, and queens often served as intermediaries between the crown and these influential households. Their continued presence, even in captivity, could reassure provincial elites that established channels of patronage and honor had not been entirely erased. Historical records suggest that the emotional dimension of captivity was inseparable from political calculation. Queens who had previously exercised authority over estates, attendants, and court ritual now operated within boundaries defined by the victors. The loss of independent decision-making was not always publicly visible, yet administrative patterns reveal a clear shift. Correspondence associated with royal women became mediated through officials loyal to the new regime, and requests for resources or religious endowments required approval that had once been unnecessary. This gradual bureaucratic filtering limited the capacity of captive queens to act autonomously while preserving the outward appearance of respect. Contemporary accounts describe how royal households were reorganized following dynastic collapse. Attendants, scribes, and guards were frequently reassigned, with trusted personnel of the conquering authority inserted into the inner court. This restructuring served dual purposes. It reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance and ensured that information flowed toward the new administration. Eunuch officials, already central to palace management, played a particularly significant role in supervising transitions, acting as intermediaries who combined intimate access with institutional loyalty. Chroniclers noted that the treatment of queens could vary significantly depending on the nature of the overthrow. Violent conquests accompanied by widespread devastation sometimes produced harsher restrictions, particularly when the defeated dynasty had maintained strong military support. In contrast, negotiated transfers of power or internal coups often resulted in more accommodating arrangements. In these circumstances, captive queens might retain limited ceremonial roles and continue to receive visitors from allied noble families under supervision. Such allowances helped prevent abrupt disruptions within aristocratic society that could threaten broader stability. Legal and administrative evidence indicates that property confiscation was implemented selectively. While royal treasuries and estates directly associated with sovereign authority were absorbed into the victor's domain, personal possessions of queens were often preserved. Jewelry, religious artifacts, and certain movable goods remained under their control, reinforcing their dignity while posing minimal political risk. This differentiation between sovereign property and personal belongings reflects a nuanced understanding of legitimacy within Persian political culture, where maintaining honor could be as important as asserting dominance. Surviving documents suggest that maternal roles profoundly shaped the experience of captive queens. Mothers of young princes were positioned within a delicate balance of vulnerability and influence. Their children represented both potential rivals and valuable instruments of integration. In several recorded instances, princes of defeated houses were educated alongside members of the conquering dynasty, receiving training in administration, language, and military practice within the imperial court. The presence of their mothers within the same controlled environment contributed to a process of gradual assimilation that reduced the likelihood of future insurrection while preserving dynastic continuity in a managed form. Historical records indicate that queens sometimes acted as cultural transmitters within these circumstances. They preserved court traditions, religious observances, and linguistic practices associated with the displaced dynasty, subtly shaping the upbringing of younger generations. This transmission did not necessarily constitute resistance. Rather, it reflected the persistence of identity within imperial pluralism. Persian imperial systems were historically capable of incorporating diverse traditions, and the controlled presence of captive queens contributed to this layered cultural environment. Contemporary accounts also describe moments in which captive queens engaged in negotiation to secure improved conditions for relatives or retainers. Requests for reduced restrictions, restoration of certain attendants, or permission to maintain religious patronage occasionally appear in administrative correspondence. The responses to such petitions varied, but their existence demonstrates that queens were not entirely without agency. Their influence operated through persuasion, reputation, and the cultivation of sympathetic relationships within the court hierarchy. Chroniclers noted that the health and age of captive queens affected their treatment. Elderly queens, particularly those unlikely to bear heirs or participate in political alliances, often experienced fewer restrictions. They could engage more freely in religious activities and were sometimes granted limited travel for pilgrimage within imperial territories under escort. Younger queens, especially those of notable lineage, remained under closer observation due to their potential involvement in marriage alliances or factional politics. Religious patronage continued to serve as a subtle arena of influence. Surviving records indicate that captive queens sponsored offerings, temple maintenance, and charitable distributions, though typically on a reduced scale. These acts reinforced their moral authority and preserved relationships with priestly communities, which themselves held social influence across regions. The conqueror's willingness to permit such activities reflects an understanding that suppressing religious expression among royal women could provoke broader dissatisfaction among local populations. Administrative tablets and later literary sources suggest that information control formed a central component of managing captive queens. Access to news regarding provincial unrest, surviving loyalists, or rival claimants was carefully regulated. Messengers were screened, correspondence was monitored, and travel permissions were limited. This informational containment prevented queens from serving as communication hubs for opposition movements while also shaping their perception of political developments beyond the palace environment. Historical evidence further indicates that the visibility of captive queens during public ceremonies was calibrated to reflect political priorities. On certain occasions, their presence reinforced narratives of orderly succession and imperial benevolence. On others, their absence signaled the consolidation of a new dynastic identity that no longer required visible association with predecessors. This strategic modulation of presence illustrates how queens functioned as instruments within evolving imperial messaging. Chroniclers occasionally reference tensions between captive queens and members of the conquering dynasty's household. Competition for influence, differences in cultural practice, and concerns over succession could generate subtle rivalries within the palace. These tensions rarely manifested in overt confrontation, but can be inferred from patterns of patronage withdrawal, reassignment of attendance, or shifts in ceremonial precedents. Such dynamics highlight the complexity of court life, in which captive queens navigated both imposed limitations and intricate interpersonal politics. Surviving documents suggest that the long-term fate of captive queens often depended on the stability of the conquering regime itself. Periods of internal unrest or succession crises could temporarily elevate their significance, as factions sought symbolic figures around whom to rally. In response, authorities might intensify restrictions or relocate queens once again to prevent their exploitation by competing political actors. This recurring cycle of diminished relevance followed by renewed concern underscores the enduring symbolic weight attached to royal women even decades after dynastic overthrow. Evidence from later Persian and neighboring empires indicates that burial practices also reflected the negotiated status of captive queens. When they died in captivity, funerary arrangements frequently balanced respect for their royal identity with the political realities of displacement. They were often interred with honors appropriate to their rank, though sometimes in locations aligned with the new dynasty's authority rather than ancestral burial grounds. Such practices reinforced the idea that while political power had shifted, royal dignity remained formally acknowledged. The cumulative evidence portrays a system in which captivity did not equate to erasure, but rather to controlled transformation. Queens became figures whose authority was curtailed, yet whose presence remained embedded within imperial society. Their experiences illuminate broader Persian strategies of governance that favored integration, surveillance, and symbolic continuity over indiscriminate elimination. The management of captive queens reveals how imperial stability depended not only on military success, but also on the careful handling of memory, legitimacy, and the human embodiments of dynastic transition. Surviving administrative patterns indicate that the final stage of a captive queen's life was often marked by gradual normalization within the structures of the new regime. Over time, the urgency surrounding her political significance diminished as generations passed, and alternative claimants either assimilated or disappeared from the historical record. This shift did not necessarily restore autonomy, but it altered the nature of confinement. Queens who had once been considered potential catalysts for unrest increasingly became senior figures within palace society, occupying roles defined more by ritual presence and advisory influence than by immediate political concern. Historical records suggest that memory management played a crucial role in this transformation. Conquering dynasties were tasked not only with controlling individuals, but also with shaping collective recollection of the displaced ruling house. Captive queens represented living repositories of that memory, embodying traditions, court etiquette, and dynastic narratives that could not be easily erased. Rather than suppressing these associations entirely, Persian imperial practice often incorporated them into a broader narrative of continuity, allowing the new dynasty to present itself as inheritor rather than destroyer of imperial order. Contemporary accounts describe how this integration was reinforced through ceremonial language and court protocol. Queens of defeated dynasties retained honorific titles and were addressed with forms of respect that acknowledged their previous status. While these titles no longer corresponded to political authority, they functioned as instruments of stability, signaling to observers that the imperial system valued hierarchy even amid transition. This careful preservation of dignity contributed to the broader Persian emphasis on maintaining social equilibrium across diverse and sometimes competing elite groups. Chroniclers noted that captive queens could serve as informal advisors, particularly in matters related to regional customs, court etiquette, and diplomatic interaction with populations formerly loyal to their dynasty. Their familiarity with provincial elites, religious institutions, and administrative traditions made them valuable sources of knowledge. Although such advisory roles rarely appear in official inscriptions, the persistence of certain regional practices following conquest suggests that the perspectives of royal women contributed to the continuity of governance in subtle ways. Legal documents and later historiographical traditions indicate that the question of remarriage remained a sensitive issue.